Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, education, weather, a lot of weather. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com, joined as always by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing, Scott, on this oddly spring-like Friday morning?
I am enjoying not having a coat on.
Yeah.
It is very nice today. Today's Friday. We as we record this, and I felt weird going out today without a coat, but good.
Yeah. Well, don't get too used to it.
No. It's still January. I mean, Come on. It's gonna get cold again. Hopefully not as bad as it was 2 weeks ago, but yeah.
Yeah, well, we do have some more weather to talk about because this was a week of still kind of like digging out, or in a lot of cases, really just sort of melting our way out of the remnants of the giant winter storm that hit us on January 15th. We will be talking about that. We're also going to touch on a county commission candidate forum that happened this past week, mostly just by way of reminding you that, hey, there's an election coming up. City Council had 2 meetings this week, a regular meeting and a work session. We will talk about housing and the alternative response model there. Some legislative action from some of our local state legislators. We'll get into that. But yeah, to start us off, Scott, let's recap a little bit on what we have all endured here these last couple of weeks. When we recorded our podcast last Friday, we were all still housebound. We had to do that one remotely. And at that point, it turned out we were not done yet. We didn't get a whole lot more accumulation this past week, but we did get a couple of days of really cold weather that combined with sort of the compaction of the existing snow and ice on a lot of our local roads that had not been cleared led to a couple more days of really hazardous driving conditions. Schools stayed closed Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They opened late on Thursday, finally got back to school after nearly 2 weeks out for weather-related reasons. So this was quite a storm, quite an event.
Yeah, the thing about it was it wasn't. I mean, it was heavy. It wasn't the blizzard of '93 by any stretch of the imagination.
Right, that was the comparison you saw lots of people.
Yeah,
making.
But it lingered because of the cold temperatures, and that was we often have temperatures that drop into the 20s, into the teens, sometimes close to zero. But usually it's a day or two, and then it gets back to
and it may not even be accompanied by precipitation. If
and
it's
it might not be
then
accompanied
it's just
by
cold.
snow. Yeah, it's just cold. So the this was unusual because it combined both. It combined heavy snow and a long, lingering cold snap, and it was it was tough. Even today, this or last week now, the city was they resumed garbage pickup, but they couldn't do recycling.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have it. It took too long to do everything and get back to that. So, bus service finally got restored on Thursday. It was a real paralyzing storm.
Yeah, and a record-setting one, as it turned out. The National Weather Service in Morristown informed us that they have good daily weather data going back to 1910. So when you hear about records here, that's mostly what we're talking about. We don't have really reliable data before 1910, but still it's a pretty good stretch, 114 years. This was the longest stretch Knoxville has ever reported in that time frame of having at least 4 inches of snow on the ground day after day. And we got up to 7 days, which was a record. The previous record was 6 days of that, which occurred in 1996. Some of you may remember. The blizzard of 93 that everybody talks about brought a lot more snow, but it also warmed up faster afterward. And so actually there was not at least 4 inches of snow on the ground in that storm for as long as there was with this one. So it really was one for the record books. And I think one thing that it did was it reminded people, or in some cases, if people have moved here in the last 25 years, probably, they haven't had the occasion to realize this. But a lot of people discovered to their disgruntlement that nobody was going to come and plow their street. And this was true both within the city, where the city of Knoxville does, public services, and outside city limits, where it's Knox County that does it. Both of those local governments have snow plans that they revisit every year, but they basically stay the same from year to year for how they will deal with snow emergencies. And those plans really focus on getting what they call the primary streets and the arterial streets and the collector streets cleared. And those are like your main and secondary streets. So Scott, you and I live in North Knoxville. So, excuse me. The primary streets are things like Broadway and Central, those main avenues that people use to travel from one part of the city to another. But then you have sort of like collector streets that run between them, streets that neighborhoods kind of pool all of their traffic onto. And those did get cleared early on and stayed cleared throughout. Basically, if you could get to those streets, there wasn't really any time during any of this that you couldn't get around the city. The challenge for a lot of people was getting to those streets because their subdivisions, or in our case, in like the older city neighborhoods, the smaller neighborhood streets, were not cleared. And there were a lot of people who were upset about that on social media, not really realizing, I guess, that is the actual snow plan.
Yes.
They say, where in the plan does my street get cleared? And the answer is, well, there's no place in the plan that your street gets cleared. Now, I think both the city and county, as they were able to, especially when we got sort of slightly warmer weather between the two really cold spells, did get out and respond on a sort of spot basis to particular areas where they had a lot of complaints, or where maybe clearing one particular stretch was going to enable a lot more people to get out. But in general, I saw some people on social media saying, so is the plan just we wait for it to melt? It's like, well, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and one of the things, too, is the reason that the plan's this way is, the plans are this way, because there are two plans we're talking about, is to make sure that emergency services can go on. It's not about me getting to work. It's about ambulances and fire trucks and police cruisers getting to emergency scenes. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things you mentioned, that the primary responsibility or primary goal is to keep the corridors and the connector streets clear, but they also make sure the hospital, roads around the hospitals are clear. That's what that's the primary goal of these plans, and everything else is gravy.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't realize that, because most storms, it's a day or two and it warms up and the streets, the snow and ice melt and we go on about our lives.
Yep.
But this time it just lingered for longer than a week.
Right. And so usually that model of on the side streets, the neighborhood streets, you wait for it to melt, that works fine, because that wait, like you say, is just a couple of days at most in general. And, the reason that they don't have a plan that addresses plowing and salting like every street in the city or every street in the county is just that there are so many of those streets. And I'm not sure what these numbers are in the city, but I know outside the city, they said that all of those primary and secondary roads that they focused on, the lane miles, so that's the miles of actual lane that like a snowplow would have to run up and down to clear it, is about 750.
It's about 500 in the city.
Okay. Well, and so the neighborhood streets, the smaller streets outside the city, those lane miles are somewhere in the vicinity of like 2,300 miles. So three times as many miles. And so if you look at, I think the county was running about 24 plows during this storm to do the 750 miles. If they wanted to do three times that, you would have to theoretically have, 72 more plows available that you don't need 99% of the time, or, this really was an unusual, like, we haven't, again, going back to 1910, we haven't had this happen. And so the idea that either the city or the county are going to budget and have both the resources in terms of, just the equipment, but then also the staff and people who are trained on them and everything ready to respond to something that has never happened in our actual recorded history. Like it's just, that's not how government budgeting works, basically.
Yeah. The if the county purchased 3 times the number of trucks and with plows and all that they currently have, the outcry every other year would be about government waste.
Yeah.
So
somebody would be down taking pictures of all of these plow trucks or dump trucks just kind of like sitting there doing nothing. Yeah. Now, I do think that it's worth contemplating, like, this hasn't happened in 30 years, but we also know that with climate change, all sorts of unusual weather patterns are popping up, and some things are becoming more common than they used to be. One of them is this weather pattern that we've seen where the polar vortex, which, again, this is one of these terms that most of us have only learned in the last 5 or 6 years as it's become something we have to actually think about. Basically the normal jet stream gets weaker and the cold air from the north has an easier time penetrating far. There's this talk about the invasion at the southern border. This is an invasion at our northern border. It's an invasion of cold air coming across. I don't know why Joe Biden's not doing anything to stop it.
You can build a wall.
That's right. Exactly. You have
Canadian
a giant
border
ice wall. I feel like there's a precedent for that in Game of Thrones, to try to keep that Canadian air out. But if this is a pattern that we have seen several times in recent years, it hasn't typically produced this. Mostly what it's produced is, some unusually cold days. But you could certainly imagine that if what has been in every 30 years or every 115 years weather event becomes something that happens every 4 or 5 years or 6 or 7 years or whatever, then I think you would start to see local governments and state governments, everybody starting to make adjustments to that and saying, okay, maybe we do need to budget to have we're not going to buy 72 more plows, but maybe we need to have 6 more. Who knows? Like, I think you could start to see those adjustments, but you're not going to do it on the basis of 1 year, one anomaly.
Right.
And so those kinds of things are always sort of going to be somewhat behind the extreme experiences, because you can't, again, you don't budget and plan around extremes.
And this isn't dismissing concerns that people had during this, and there were many people who could not leave their houses for several days. It was a hardship on them. Thankfully, we didn't have widespread power outages, which we did have in the blizzard of '93.
Right.
And but it's not to downplay those hardships. It's more explaining how the reason you didn't get your street plowed in your subdivision or your residential neighborhood in the city.
Well, I mean, basically, this was a natural disaster.
Yeah.
A record-setting winter storm is a natural disaster, and natural disasters are disruptive, whether that's an earthquake or a flood or wildfires or whatever. They are disruptive, and they can be dangerous. There's all sorts of bad things that can happen in them, and our local governments do a lot of planning around these things.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you're always going to sort of be working off of past experience, because that's really all you can kind of go on. And so anything that's not in accord from, the farther away any individual event is from the historical mean, the more disruptive it's going to be. That's just the way these things are. Now, one thing unusual about this storm was, for the first time, we had the city, the county, and then some churches and local agencies come together to try to address the needs specifically of our local homeless population with these warming centers. And Scott, you wrote a really good sort of debriefing on that this week about how that all came together and how it worked. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's good that you mentioned planning. One of the things that they announced these planning centers that they were going to have them in December, before the cold spell that we had, the winter storm. But this is something that they planned, and it a lot of people seem to think that this was kind of a spontaneous reaction. It wasn't. It was something that was planned. The city and the county have an office of housing of housing stability that they formed last year to address these types of issues, and they reached out to churches. We had to provide space for these warming centers, and they had 3 that they set up. They were and they looked at data. I mean, they went back and looked at the weather data. They went back and they looked at maps of where homeless encampments were outside of the downtown core, and located these places accordingly.
Because people in the downtown core have easier access to the other services.
They've got
the
traditional shelters,
right?
And so they came up with this plan to have these 3 churches. Vestal United Methodist Church in South Knoxville, Magnolia Avenue United Methodist Church in East Knoxville, and Cokesbury Church in West Knoxville to open their doors on the coldest nights of the year. Now, when they look back at the weather data, 1 or 2 nights, and during the day it would probably be warm enough for them to, whoever stayed overnight could go back to where their tents are or wherever they stayed, and then come back if the weather was cold again. They didn't envision this storm. It just was, as we said, unprecedented as in modern times, and they were overwhelmed. here's one of the cases that relying on data can bite you. Is they looked at what's known as the point in time count. That is the Department of Housing and Urban Development requires communities to go out and actually count people who are homeless on one night of the year. It's January 25th. We just had it. This year's just the other day. That count in 2023 showed there were 123 people in Knoxville who were living in tents or in cars, essentially. Places where, they weren't staying in shelters, they weren't couch surfing, they weren't doing that, they were living in tents. Well, there are a lot more people that are doing that. Because, obviously, that type of count, it's hard to get everyone. You're not.
Yeah, and they always caveat those counts by saying that they are always undercounts because everybody who they're counting is a real person who they see and count, but they know they're not getting everybody.
They know they're not getting everybody. But the warming centers were set up to accommodate about 125 people, which is roughly the point in time count from 2023. The first night of when it was basically just snow. That's about the number they had. They had 123 the first night. After that, it exploded. The average over the course of the 7 days was 225 people. And the highest number they had on any one night was 288.
Wow.
And and a lot of the people who came to those warming centers were people who never take advantage of the regular shelters or any kind of social services. They are truly living on their own wherever they can. And there were a lot of issues involved with that. A lot of frostbite. That was one of the things that Aaron Reed, who's the director of the Office of Housing Stability, really emphasized was there were people out there who were freezing, and they brought them in there, and they saved lives. And now there were some who have apparently died of exposure. The medical examiner's office is still investigating. There were 3 people that are considered homeless who died. But given the number of people who got sheltered, and that's I think you could say that was very successful in keeping people alive.
Yeah, because you think about, first of all, it was the need to get the information out to people who were homeless, letting them know about the availability of these centers. And it's not an easy population to communicate that kind of information to. Yeah. And then people actually being able to physically get to them, also a challenge. And so, right, they were able to obviously serve a huge number of people.
Yeah, that was one of the big challenges they had, was because we had the heavy snow and the roads weren't cleared. A lot of people that they assumed would be able to get there more easily couldn't. They had people who went out and tried to go to these camps and get people. The Knoxville Police Department helped out some on doing that. Of course, that's kind of difficult because when the police show up at a homeless camp, they think, they're there to arrest somebody. No, they're actually trying to get them to go to a warming center. But that was a challenge, and it was also a challenge because they relied on volunteers. Mm-hmm. These churches. One of the reasons they use churches instead of opening up public buildings was churches not only have space, but they have a network of volunteers. Generally, they're members, and who see doing things like this as their mission in life. And so they, but the volunteers had a hard time getting to these places. And because of the extended period of time the weather was bad, the warming centers were open 24/7. The original plan was to just be open overnight, and volunteers would only be needed overnight. Here we had volunteers who were there for days on end, doing, taking care of people, keeping them warm, making sure they were fed, and getting food to people was a challenge as well, because they needed more food than they ever thought they needed. But one of the things that Erin Reed talked about, and she got emotional when I interviewed her about this, was how people in the community responded. She was very, she said her biggest fear was that nobody would care. Well, a lot of people cared, and a lot of people helped, even though, they couldn't go to work. They couldn't get, they had a hard time getting out of their houses, but they showed up at these churches and helped out.
Mm-hmm. So I gather that they mostly saw this as a successful effort, even if it was one that they had to make a lot of adjustments to as it went, including at the South Knoxville location. They had to actually relocate from the church to the South Knox Community Center because of some plumbing issues and so forth at the church. Yeah,
they had a couple issues. One was the plumbing issue, because they were just overwhelmed. I mean, they had many more people than they anticipated. And another thing, and this is something that people might not think about, they thought about it in planning this, is that the Vestal United Methodist Church had an open space for people to stay, but with so many people, they didn't. And there are issues with putting people in small rooms in this particular population, small rooms. One of them is drug use and overdose. And then there were several overdoses that they were prepared for, and they had Narcan on site to administer, and they saved several people who overdosed, and they didn't ask questions when people came in. They didn't say, "Well, are you on drugs? Are you drinking?" They didn't ask that. It was a low barrier. If you showed up, they gave you a place to stay, and so the South Knox Community Center had a larger open space, and they were able to move the population there in South Knoxville and take care of them for the final days of the storm.
Mm-hmm. Did Erin Reed have any big takeaways from this in terms of how they might address the next incident?
Oh, yes, certainly. The big takeaway was the need is greater than the data indicated beforehand, and so they are going to. And this was a pilot program. We don't know what it's going to look like in the future. That's one of the things they're going to take the lessons they've learned and try to apply that. They do it in the future. They're going to plan for up to 300 people rather than 125, so that they don't have the space issues that they had and the supply issues that they had. That's one major takeaway that they had from that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it was a heck of a storm.
It was,
and we are now on the other side of it. Of course, we are still just at the end of January here. We still have another month plus of theoretical winter weather to go. We'll see how all that goes.
And all these people that stayed in the warming centers. Now that's in addition. Remember, that's in addition to the people who stay in shelters, which is
hundreds.
400 or 500 people who stay in the regular shelters. These people are still out there, and if we have another severe cold snap, they will have to live through that as well. And it's not clear how long, when they would be able to ramp back up this program. As I said, they were originally going to do this, have it a 15-day window in January, and we'll see if it see what happens in the future on the weather there. But that's one thing that a lot of times there are incidents that people respond to, and in many ways nobly respond to, regarding people who are homeless. But they're always homeless. It's not that just because the warming center shut down doesn't mean these people have a place to stay.
Right. Yep. Well, one thing that got shut down by the storm for about a week was the state legislature. I saw some people joking online that was the best thing the storm accomplished, was it kept our legislators out of mischief for a week. But they came back this past week, as they do, whether we want them to or not. And there were a couple of interesting things involving a couple of Knox County legislators this past week. One was Sam McKenzie, state representative for the 15th district here in Knoxville, who is one of just two Democrats in our state legislative delegation. He and Representative John Ray Clemens, who's the chair of the House Democratic Caucus, had a little press conference this past week that was interesting. They say that Governor Bill Lee's education commissioner, Lizette Gonzalez Reynolds, who he hired last year, is legally not qualified for her job. And they point to a pretty specific statute, is in state law, passed by the legislature. I'm not actually sure how long this has been on the books, but it requires that the education commissioner be somebody of scientific and or literary attainment, somewhat vague phrase, who has experience in school administration, somewhat more specific, and is qualified to teach in the highest level school that they oversee, which is pretty specific. Because, and it says shall be in front of those clauses. It says this person shall be. And as McKenzie and Clemens argued, Reynolds does not meet at least some of those criteria. Now, they said, okay, scientific and literary attainment. On her resume, they didn't really see anything obvious that would testify to that. She hasn't written any novels or books of poetry or conducted groundbreaking scientific experiments. But, you could say, all right, that's a little bit of, it's kind of fuzzy vague language. You could say a lot of things qualify as that. School administration, her resume is interesting. It's mostly a political resume, but she does have a lot of education experience in state and federal education administration, much of it tied to George W. Bush. She worked for Bush's office when he was governor of Texas, and then she went along with him, along with, I think, a lot of people who worked for him in Texas when he was elected president, and she ended up at the U.S. Department of Education, spent quite a while there. She then went back to Texas, worked for the Texas state level Department of Education. So she is working in public education here, but she's not, does that count as school administration? Usually when we talk about school administration, you think principals or superintendents. She's never worked for a school district. She hasn't worked for a school system anywhere. All of her jobs have been sort of at these, political appointee in the education bureaucracy. But certainly you could at least argue that, well, all of that counts as school administration, whether it's at the state or federal level. Okay, you can make that argument. But the thing about being qualified to teach is just kind of, it looks on paper like a significant stumbling block because she's not, and she's never been qualified to teach in any state in the country, including Tennessee. And nobody made an issue of this when Lee appointed her last year. It's not like her resume was a secret. I think maybe the Democrats in the legislature, along with the Republicans, along with maybe Bill Lee, nobody went and looked at the actual statute maybe to make sure that they were checking all those boxes. And so McKenzie and Clemens just basically said, Like, she's got to go. Like, just like she doesn't meet, like, these requirements are really clear. She just doesn't meet them. She needs to resign. If she doesn't, Lee needs to basically fire her and replace her with somebody. And that was their pitch. The education department just basically came out and said, nah, she's fine. I wrote and asked them, and they wrote back and said, she's qualified by her experience. They didn't directly address like how her experience squares with the specific requirements here. And the kind of a little bit of a tell there that they may have belatedly realized this could be an issue is they said she's qualified for her experience, not a problem. And also, she's currently enrolled in a program at the University of Tennessee's Martin campus, a teacher preparation program there, that once she completes it, she would theoretically be licensed to teach in the state. I don't think that's what she's looking to do. She's not getting that degree so she can go be a teacher. But they said that that wasn't required. She was only doing that to broaden her knowledge, basically. Okay. And I think that it looks like that's just kind of where this is going to sit for now. I don't know if the Democrats might follow up with some sort of lawsuit or something. They've raised this issue, but obviously as the super minority party in the legislature, they don't have any means to, I guess they could introduce a resolution to impeach her or something, but obviously that's not going to go anywhere. But it's just an interesting case where you have what seems to be a pretty clearly written law that the governor and one of his top appointees appears to be in violation of, and they're just basically saying, nope, not a problem.
Yeah, it's kind of nothing to see here, move along.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
You could make all sorts of points about people, Tennessee citizens, who are routinely flagged and prosecuted for technical violations of one law or another, who do not have the option. I guess you always have the option of going to court and saying, Your Honor, this law doesn't apply to me, but you're not going to get far with that in many cases. But maybe if you're the governor, that's okay. I guess we'll see if there's any further follow-up on that, but it was at least an interesting point to be raised. Another local legislator also made the news this week. State Rep Jason Zachary, Republican Farragut, one of the most culturally conservative members of the local county delegation, one of the most anti-abortion members of the local delegation. He has introduced a bill that would make it a felony for any adult who is not the parent or legal guardian of a minor, of a person under 17, to help that minor access abortion services. And so this is I saw this bill mischaracterized a couple of places. There were some people putting out information that, this would prosecute, like if your daughter was raped and became pregnant and you took her out of state to get an abortion, that you could be prosecuted. That is not what the bill says. The bill clearly says it does not apply to parents and legal guardians. But it would apply to, and people have all sorts of home situations. They have all sorts of legal guardianship type situations, including sometimes situations that can be abusive and threatening. This would apply to, say, a 16-year-old who is raped or becomes pregnant by any means and is afraid of talking to their parents about it or their legal guardians about it for fear of any number of things that might happen as a result of that, but confides in, who knows, an older cousin, an aunt, an uncle, a family friend, and anybody like that. If any of those folks helped that 16-year-old, say, travel out of state to access abortion services someplace where they're legal, or access drugs through the mail that could do medically assisted abortions, that adult, that family friend or relative or whoever it is, could be charged with a felony under this. And beyond that, there's also a civil part of the bill where they could also be sued by the person, the minor themselves, first of all. So let's say you help somebody and then they decide 2 years later that they're upset about you providing that help. They could sue you. The biological father of the fetus, whether that's, you know, a 15-year-old kid or an older person or whatever, they could sue as long as they didn't commit a crime in the course of creating the pregnancy. So if you rape somebody and they have an abortion, you can't
sue
the person who helped them get the abortion. That is not allowed, contemplated under this. But and, you know, this is kind of spinning out the most extreme cases. But, for example, if a stepfather raped a stepdaughter and she became pregnant and didn't want to tell their mother about it because of, you know, the family dynamics or whatever, and their aunt helped them get out of state to get an abortion. Now, the stepfather couldn't sue because he committed rape. Okay, not allowed to sue under that circumstance. But the mother could. Let's say the mother in that case is furious at, you know, the aunt who helped the girl, even though the girl was a victim of rape. You could still be sued. You could be sued for damage. So you could face both felony prosecution and be sued for damages. And this bill got a lot of attention. Of course, Planned Parenthood and various other reproductive rights organizations came out and heavily criticized it, saying it basically, you know, what you're contemplating in this is essentially a minor who has a pregnancy that they do not want. So you're starting out with somebody who's in a, you know, a vulnerable position to start with, and evidently doesn't have, because parents could still provide that help without prosecution. They can't do it in Tennessee. You can't get an abortion of any kind in Tennessee. Don't get me wrong. But this gets into, you know, ever since abortion became illegal in Tennessee after the overturning of the Roe decision, and in other states that have effectively banned it, people have been expecting that we're going to see bills that start to eat away at, you know, it's like, okay, you've already banned abortion in the state. How do you start to limit people who live in the state's ability to go outside the state or to receive, you know, medication through the mail or whatever? How do you crack down on that? And there's been a lot of speculation about what kinds of bills and laws we might see along those lines. Some states have introduced various kinds of bills that could penalize people for going out of state to access abortion. So this is one small step in that direction. This would not open up the pregnant minor themselves to prosecution or lawsuits. It's kind of aiming at that person who's going to provide that assistance to them. But it is a step toward, like, we've banned it in the state. How do we start to try to kind of fence off? How do we build a wall around Tennessee to stop people from going out of state to access those services? And that is, I think, the reason that even though this bill, you know, is kind of narrowly written, and probably, even though any case it does apply to is likely to be a pretty awful set of circumstances, it's also going to be a small number of cases. But it is a step. It's a step towards saying, okay, we want to try to figure out how to stop people who are in Tennessee from going out of Tennessee to receive abortion services.
Yeah, and it's going to face a difficult time in the courts, I think. One of the things is in the United States, one state can't regulate what happens in another state, and the borders between states aren't like national borders; they're boundaries. But for instance, the state of Tennessee can't make it a crime to go to Las Vegas and gamble, even though gambling is illegal in Tennessee. You can go to Vegas and gamble because it's legal there. Same and gun laws are the same way. I mean, you can. There are states that have stricter gun laws, but their citizens can come to Tennessee and follow Tennessee law and purchase their guns here. It's not. It's very. The courts take a very dim view of of one state trying to prevent another state from enforcing its laws or allowing things under their laws. So, I'm no constitutional scholar, and never pretended to be, but that looks like a really difficult road ahead for this law if it becomes law.
So I have a question real quick. I'm sorry to interrupt, guys. Would it currently, under Tennessee law, be criminal for an adult to take a minor out of state without the parent's permission in the first place?
I mean, I think it would depend on the circumstances.
Just like if I went and took my nephew to Lexington for a basketball game but didn't tell the parent about it, and my brother in this
I mean, there are sort
scenario.
of human trafficking statutes that are out there. A lot of this depends on
I'm just saying, like, if
I think there's cases where it could be, but
if
I think
I
it's
upset
hard
my brother enough that he could try to claim it as a kidnapping, basically, because I took his
Right.
kid without his permission anywhere, whether it's out of state or not, that would already theoretically apply, at least on the criminal side. The civil side's a whole nother animal on this particular. But I was just like, that part seems kind of almost redundant to me for a little bit.
Theoretically, I think that's would be a possibility. I, for one, would probably want to see you prosecuted by taking my kid to a Kentucky basketball game. No, but
I mean, I would deserve it. Don't get me wrong.
But I mean, there are all kinds of things that can be technical violations, and then you get to prosecutorial discretion. Would a district attorney general actually bring charges against you for taking your nephew to a basketball game? That depends on the circumstances.
Yeah.
But I guess my question is, it would really depend on their parents. I think the biggest part of that, on whether a prosecutor would take that case, is whether the parent is at least alleging that it was a kidnapping.
One thing, I mean, that would, obviously they wouldn't even know about it if the parent didn't allege it was a kidnapping. But one thing that people need to remember is that on the criminal side, it's the state of Tennessee,
right,
that prosecutes you. It's not the parent or an individual. It's the state of Tennessee, and the state of Tennessee's representative, the district attorney general, is the one who decides whether to bring cases or not. Now, that said, typically they do defer a lot to the purported victim of a crime,
right?
But it's the prosecutor's call.
Yeah.
Well, and the cases like this that we hear about the most typically have to do with custody, where like a non-custodial parent will take a child and cross state lines or whatever. And you will hear about people being charged in those cases. But in those cases, there's generally a court-ordered custodial agreement. Yeah. So the person, it's not that they're violating a state law. They're violating a specific court order.
Yeah, they're not just making their ex-spouse mad. That's
right. They're making the state mad because they didn't do what the court.
They're violating a court order, which is a state order. I mean, judges are state officials.
So, we don't even know if this bill is going to pass yet. Last time I checked, there was not yet a Senate sponsor for it. If it does move through the legislature, I'm sure we'll hear a lot about it as it's going through. And as you say, Scott, if it passes, we will most likely see some kind of legal challenge to it. So we'll have to see. But, I think we talked about this back when the abortion ban first came into effect in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And we said at that point that anybody who thinks, well, we've banned abortion, we're not going to hear about abortion anymore from the state legislature. Absolutely not true. We're going to hear it. We're going to continue, just as we did before abortion was banned, we're going to continue to hear about abortion every single year because it is a popular political issue with a subset of the population, but a significant part of especially the Republican base. I do want to remind people that both state and national polls routinely show that the majority of Americans and the majority of Tennesseans support legal access to abortion within certain parameters. And that was true before this decision came down and before the law passed. It continues to be true now. The majority of people in this state do not support according to every poll that anybody's done on it, the abortion laws that we have. But because it is a politically powerful issue, especially in some Republican primaries and in some very Republican districts, even though we already have a law that by all indications is much stricter than the people who live in this state want, we're going to continue to see further attempts to make it stricter and stricter. And we were talking about this with gun issues last week, but this is another one of those issues where basically this will happen right up until people start losing elections because of it. Like if people want to know, like, how far can you push things before there's a change? That's always where...
That's a pretty good gauge.
Yeah. If people ever start losing elections because they think Tennessee has too strict abortion laws or too loose gun laws, that's when you might start to see those things change.
Yeah.
But that hasn't happened yet, and unless and until it happens, no matter what the polls say, we're just not going to see any changes in this. Okay, so that was some legislative action this week. City Council had 2 meetings this week. Even with the snow and the ice and the fog and everything else, City Council soldiered on.
They sure did.
And at some length, too. So, Scott, two different things came up. At their Tuesday meeting, they contemplated Mayor Kincannon's proposed middle housing initiative, which we've talked about a lot. And then they had a Thursday workshop talking about the alternative response model for people who are experiencing a mental health crisis. So catch us up on both of those.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the middle housing proposal, and we don't need to get exhaustive about it, but basically what it does is it would make it easier to build duplexes, triplexes, very small apartment buildings in the traditional residential neighborhoods around downtown, inside the I-640 Beltway, essentially. And its goal would be to provide more housing options for people and to increase density a little bit, because the city can't grow by annexing, so they, if you want to increase the population in the city, it's going to have to be through density. So it's been bandied about a lot. It took 2 tries to get it out of the Planning Commission review of it, but at the meeting on Tuesday, it sailed through, essentially, and that was the first read. It's a series of ordinance changes to the zoning code, which require 2 readings, and this was the first one. And barring some kind of sea change, it'll pass this next week as well when it's heard on second reading. But there were people who raised concerns about maintaining neighborhood integrity, that sort of thing. The single family housing is which has been the model all across the United States, and in Knoxville's no exception since World War II. People don't want to see their property values reduced or anything, and they're concerned that this would happen here. The one thing that kind of came up that was not really new, but one thing that was emphasized in the meeting was that other cities who've implemented this middle housing approach have only seen incremental changes. It's not something where somebody's going to come in, tear down all the buildings on a street and build a bunch of duplexes. It's going to be probably, for the most part, infill housing on vacant lots here and there throughout these neighborhoods. It's every city that they talked about. One of them that came in most often was Minneapolis. this is a very incremental change, and it was never designed to be, the magic elixir to solve the housing shortage in the city, but it's part. It's part of the cocktail, but it's not the whole cocktail. So, but anyway, it passed very easily, and they'll consider it again in 2 weeks. Then on Thursday, they held a public hearing on alternative response, and we've talked about this a lot too. This was the idea that a lot of emergency calls dealing with mental health issues and substance abuse and other things can be handled not by police, but by a team consisting of a mental health professional and an EMT or medic of some sort, where there's no law enforcement involvement at all. Knoxville Police Department currently has a program with the McNabb Center where they pair officers with mental health workers to respond to these calls, but they're woefully shorthanded. One of the people who testified, the head of the YWCA here in Knoxville, said that they'd called for the co-response team to come. They were only able to come. They've called them 5 times. They've only been able to come 2. Because the other 3 times nobody was on shift.
It's not a 24/7.
It's not a 24/7. They want it to be a 24/7 thing, but they don't have the staffing to do that. The police department said, "We're committed to it. Give us, we need the resources." And that was one of the things that came out, that regardless of whether you use the co-response model where there is police involvement or the alternative response model, which doesn't have police involvement, the resources aren't there. That more is needed, and that was a big takeaway. If you were there and just kind of a neutral observer, that was one of the big takeaways, is that really it doesn't matter what your response is if you don't have people to respond. And there was some interesting discussion. There's a program in Eugene, Oregon called Cahoots that does this alternative response model. They had a representative from Cahoots who joined the hearing via Zoom and talked about how they run their program. It's a little, I think a lot of people get the idea that these kind of programs exist completely separate from law enforcement and firefighting operations, but that's not the case there. They work with them. It's very, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of training for dispatchers, because the dispatchers are the ones who decide whether to send a police officer or send this team. So there's some hurdles there. The one thing that the consensus from this, remember, this was it was a public hearing. There was no votes or anything, but the consensus among council members was we need to form a task force to look at implementing this. And a majority of the council members who spoke, all the ones who spoke in favor of doing that. Councilwoman Lynn Fugit was a little cautious. She had a couple of caveats. One was she wanted to make sure that she would like to make sure that this process is facilitated by someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight, so that you don't go to predetermined outcomes. And another one was, and this is a very real concern, is you've got to have an organization to do this, and there is no organization to do this. I mean, by organization, I mean a Cahoots in Eugene is a part of a larger nonprofit, and they have the infrastructure to do it, because whoever does this, they're going to have to buy vans. They're going to have to hire social workers. They're going to have to hire medics. They're going to have to, and these are all fields also where there are labor shortages. So there's some hurdles there, but council is the consensus was to move forward with a task force to look at exactly how to solve resolve those issues.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, more to come there probably.
Oh, absolutely.
And I know that the McNabb Center, which provides the mental health professionals for the co-response teams, they have said that they wouldn't want to be part of this kind of model, right? They're most comfortable with their employees having officers with them. They are more comfortable doing that, although they've softened that somewhat. Mm-hmm.
They want to be. They had a representative at the hearing who said they wanted to be part of the solution. And even KPD. I mean, one of the things that Chief Noel has said is, hey, if the city sets up something where I don't have to, I can take my officers and devote them to fighting crime rather than responding to these crises, great. Mm-hmm. Now he's not endorsing any particular approach, but his thing is I want to fight crime, and I want to devote the majority of, or if not all of my resources toward that. And that was one of the things that came out of this meeting too, is that a lot of the service providers who spoke and all said that we can do both types of approaches. We can do but we need to do more. I mean, that was the thing that kept coming up is whichever response model you follow, whether it's the co-response model or the alternative response or both, we need more. And that was the big takeaway, I think, from that meeting, is just the lack of resources to respond to mental health and substance abuse crisis.
Right. All right. Well, I also wanted to mention a candidate forum that happened this Thursday evening, mostly by way of just reminding everybody that there is an election coming up on March 5th. The presidential and county primary is that day, and there are a bunch of county positions on the ballot and a bunch of candidates running for them. There are 7 county commission seats up this year with only 2 incumbents running, 4 school board seats up with only 1 incumbent running, and also the county law director, property assessor, and there is a criminal court judge position as well on the ballot. Many of those have primary contests. Looking at the county commission races alone, there are 27 candidates running for those 7 seats. And so the League of Women Voters of Knoxville, Knox County, as a lot of people probably know, regularly organizes candidate forums ahead of local elections to try to inform the public, along with a host of partner organizations. And for the county commission this year, they, I think, wisely split it in half because there are just so many people running. And so the first county commission forum was this past Thursday at the Beck Cultural Exchange Center, and it was candidates for districts 1, 2, 6, and 8. There will be a second forum for commission candidates from districts 4, 5, and 9 on February 13th. So put that on your calendar. And there was actually a pretty good turnout at this one on Thursday. 11 candidates running for those 4 seats showed up. And I was the moderator for it, just reading questions submitted by the audience. About 30 to 40 people turned out. Not a bad crowd for a Thursday night. The event was also live streamed by the League of Women Voters, and you can find that video on their Facebook page, League of Women Voters of Knoxville, Knox County. I'm not going to even try to tell you what any individual candidate said because, again, there were 11 of them. We were only able to get through about 4 questions plus opening and closing statements because if you do the math on 11 people with 90 seconds apiece to answer, it's like to get any one question answered took 15 minutes or so. But we did have some coverage of that, which you can find on our website with just some snippets, highlights of things that people said. Very predictably, the biggest issues that got a lot of conversation from a lot of candidates had to do with growth and development, the advanced Knox planning process, and kind of all of the issues around how do you balance development with preservation of existing neighborhoods or of farmland and rural areas and so forth. So there was a lot of talk about that. And of course, we will be doing individual profiles of each of the primary contests in the coming weeks, but just trying to keep that on everybody's radar because coming out of the holidays and then going straight into the crazy winter weather, I don't think there were a lot of people out door knocking during that week of snow and cold. And so people may not even be aware that there is an election just about to knock on our doors. Early voting actually starts on February 14th, so we're just over 2 weeks away from that. So you can watch CompassKnox.com for election information, and you can find all the information about the election, see who's on the ballot, and all of that at knoxvotes.org, which is the website of the Knox County Election Commission. Speaking of forums, as we look ahead to this coming week, there's not actually a lot on the civic calendar this week because this is one of these weird weeks where it's sort of like the last week of one month and the first week of another month, so it kind of falls between a lot of scheduled meetings. But we were just talking about the school board races. There is a school board forum, candidate forum coming up on January 30th at 6:30 p.m. at the Lennon-Sini United Methodist Church on Dandridge Avenue. And so, again, that's 4 school board seats are up there. And if you want to see what the people running for them have to say, come on out to that. And then, Scott, the UT Knoxville Campus Advisory Board is meeting this coming week too, right?
Yeah, they are. It is, as the name suggests, an advisory board. So there's no policy decisions to get made or anything, but it is a good chance for Chancellor Donnie Plowman to tell the community what's going on with campus. They're going to talk about one of the major things they're going to talk about are the capital projects that are going on, the new dormitories that they're building, the entertainment center and hotel that they're talking about building. So I'm sure those will be brought up. They haven't actually published the agenda yet, but those are the types of things that that typically they talk about. She will give them an update on everything that's going on with the campus, and I'm sure they'll also talk about enrollment and growth and that sort of thing.
And when is that meeting?
That is Friday.
All right. Well, we will be back next week to talk about those things and anything else that happens in the interim. Maybe less weather. Maybe this will be the first week in a few where we don't have to talk about the weather. We'll find out. Knock on whatever.
I did not sign up to be a hick version of Todd Howell.
Right.
You know, I did not sign up for that, so I don't want to talk about weather again for a while.
Let's hope. We'll leave that to the professionals. All right. Well, thanks as always to Lord Seth Barber for his production services with Barbarian Productions here. And our theme music is by Will Wright. Have a good week, everybody.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily, in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point Podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.